Nasser had always loved flowers. Their poetic fragility, their delicate ability to bloom in defiance of the harsh world, reminded him of himself. Back home, in the small village he'd grown up in, flowers on the streets were scarce, but he used to cherish the rare clumps of jasmine climbing broken fences, refusing to acknowledge boundaries. The world, however, hadn't been kind to him. After his parents passed away, he was sent to live with his uncle, a man whose hands, instead of nurturing, only ever sought to harm. At 16, he made the daring decision to escape. An old cargo boat took him across the Mediterranean and into Europe, where every breath he took felt slightly freer. But survival wasn't easy. With no family, no papers, and only a handful of words in the local language, Nasser found himself working odd jobs just to keep from sleeping on the streets. The flower shop he found was the smallest corner of refuge, tucked away at the edge of a cobblestone street. Its owner, a kind woman named Helena, offered him work when she saw his tenacity and his careful hands arranging bouquets. Nasser also worked evenings at a nearby coffee house, where he cleaned tables after customers had gone, too shy to do more than exchange pleasantries. The days left him exhausted, but they offered shelter from his past, a life he never wanted to return to. In the flower shop, one customer stood out. A tall man whose presence seemed both enigmatic and haunting would appear nearly every week. His face was hidden behind a scarf. His dark, almond-shaped eyes were the only part of him visible, peeking out over the fabric that concealed his nose and mouth. He often came in at dusk, choosing bouquets thoughtfully. Sometimes lilies, sometimes roses, other times simple daisies. Nasser caught glimpses of deep sadness in those eyes of his, but the man barely spoke. His voice was hushed, his words brief, as though they were measured carefully. "Do you like working here?" he had asked Nasser once, after Nasser had handed him a carefully wrapped bouquet of peonies. The boy had managed a small nod. Yes, he replied, his voice quiet but sincere. Then he added almost instinctively, "Flowers remind me of home." The man's eyes lingered on him for what felt like an eternity. Perhaps Nasser imagined it, but there was a softness there, a tenderness he couldn't quite place, just as the doorbell jingled and the man left with his bouquet. As time went by, Nasser began noticing him more, a figure standing at a distance on the opposite side of the street, observing silently. Whether at the coffee house or the flower shop, the man's silent watchfulness unnerved him at first. But then, like his bruised heart, the feeling of unease waned, replaced by something else. Curiosity. One cold autumn evening, Nasser wasn't feeling himself. His shifts had stretched long that week. He had been skipping meals to save what little money he earned. The flower shop was quiet as the early evening set in, and the boy couldn't ignore the ache in his body nor the chills rising up his spine. Finally, with a shaking hand, he flipped the sign on the door to closed. The streets were unusually empty, the air sharp with a bitter wind. Nasser gathered his coat tightly around himself and took a tentative step forward. Before he could make it 5 paces, dizziness clouded his vision like swirling smoke. The world tilted. He tried to steady himself against a lamppost but missed, knees buckling underneath him. And then, darkness. The next thing Nasser felt was warmth. Faint warmth, paired with the softness of a linen bed beneath him. He stirred, groggy and confused, as foreign scents filled his senses. Rich citrus notes mixed with the faint aroma of mint. When his eyes fluttered open, his surroundings blurred into view. A simple room with olive-green walls, lined with bookshelves and alcoves holding candles. And then there was his caretaker, sitting across the room, his scarf still covering much of his face. "You fainted," the man said gently, his voice low but clear. "I found you outside the flower shop." Nasser sat up quickly, panic evident on his thin, pale face. "Where am I? Who are you? I need to go—" Nasser's voice broke the silence, his fear palpable as he glanced around the unfamiliar room. "Wait," the man said, raising his hands in a calming gesture. "You were unwell. I couldn't leave you there." His voice was a soothing balm against Nasser's panic. He stepped closer, raising a mug of what smelled like tea. Just drink this. You can leave once you feel better. His words carried a promise of safety. Nasser hesitated, glancing nervously at the scarf. "Why do you hide your face?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man froze momentarily before lowering the tea mug to the nightstand. His answer was cryptic, his gaze flickering away as he said softly, "Sometimes people need time before they can face certain truths." Silence wrapped around them like a shroud until Nasser reached for the tea, the warmth of the mug a small comfort in the midst of uncertainty. He sipped tentatively, its warmth filling his insides like the first rays of morning light after a storm. Days passed after that night. The man hadn't offered much explanation, only that his name was Youssef, and he was familiar with Nasser's work at the flower shop and coffee house. When Nasser asked about the scarf again, Youssef evaded the question, his responses quiet and careful. Still, Youssef started visiting the flower shop more frequently. His purchases seemed less habitual now. Sometimes he'd linger longer and ask Nasser about his arranging methods. Other times, he'd sit quietly at the cafe during Nasser's evening shift, a steaming cup filled with cardamom-scented coffee in his hands as he watched the boy wipe tables. Eventually, what started as fragmented conversations grew into something warmer. Youssef told Nasser about his time working abroad, his interest in literature, his family's history of owning land in the south, careful details, revealing pieces of himself bit by cautious bit. Nasser, growing increasingly intrigued, found himself asking questions back. "Why do you come here so often?" Or, "What's your favorite flower?" And yet he couldn't ignore the question tugging most insistently on his mind. Why did Youssef seem to know him so well? The secret unraveled slowly. It began one evening, not unlike that first cold night. Nasser, now familiar with Youssef's gentle mannerisms, was organizing bouquets after hours when Youssef stepped inside. "Come sit," he said softly, motioning toward the corner table. Nasser hesitated but obeyed, watching as the taller man sat across from him. There was an unfamiliar intensity in Youssef's eyes. "Do you trust me?" Youssef asked suddenly, his voice almost a whisper. The question pierced through Nasser like a bolt, and he swallowed hard. I think I do," he admitted. Youssef sighed deeply and lowered his scarf, revealing his face for the first time. His sharp features told a story of strength and of shared ancestry. Nasser's breath caught. His heart raced in disbelief as he stammered, You're my cousin. How did you—" "I followed you," Youssef admitted. "From the moment you ran away, I made it my duty to protect you," Youssef confessed, his voice steady yet filled with an undercurrent of emotion. "Your father entrusted me to look after you before he passed. But I feared if you knew who I was, you would flee again." Tears welled up in Nasser's eyes and he stood abruptly, backing toward the door. "Why would you hide from me? I thought—" His words faltered, caught in the storm of emotions swirling inside him. "Because I failed you once," Youssef's voice broke, his expression filled with regret. "I knew what your uncle was doing to you, and I didn't stop him. I thought if I stayed silent, it would protect our family's honor, but I was wrong. Letting you suffer wasn't forgivable, and when you fled, I couldn't lose you again. Forgive me for hiding. I only wanted a chance to make things right." The truth shattered Nasser's world. He had spent years running, believing himself orphaned and alone. And now, here was this man. A cousin, a protector, someone who had carried the weight of knowing his pain all along. Trust didn't come easily. But over the following weeks, Youssef proved himself every step of the way, helping Nasser navigate the harsh world, offering thoughtful advice, and simply being present in ways no one had ever been for Nasser before. Their bond deepened with time, shaped by quiet moments spent arranging flowers together, sipping coffee as the European countryside slept, and weaving through the threads of their shared Arab identity. In Youssef, Nasser found something unexpected, a sense of belonging, safety, and even the faint stirrings of love. What began as a relationship shrouded in secrecy grew into one rooted in trust, care, and healing for both of them. Together they created a future where shared pain was replaced with shared hope, blooming like flowers on the very streets where Nasser once believed he'd never find his way.